Right, okay, hello. Welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is James Wrigley and I'm joined today with Jonathan Tomlinson as co-directors of Then There Was Us. Then There Was Us is a platform committed to promoting and championing the most exciting and engaging stories, projects and works with powerful narratives from individuals and communities across the globe. Through our online content, printed publications and collaborative projects, we want to open up the conversations around events, people, places, culture and more. The Ways of Living Archive, which is what we'll be discussing today, was a project originally in partnership between Then There Was Us and OpenEye Gallery and existed as an online platform surrounding the relationships between creatives and the climate crisis, looking at exploring a wide range of practitioners whose work focuses on and examines the wider conversations of climate, such as food, local production, sourcing, transport, people and place, migration, energy, nature, biodiversity, land use, water, clean air, population, habitats, materials, and even historical context. The project addressed the urgent issues of climate change and the many ways in which people are adapting to a rapidly changing world. One of the challenging aspects of this project and the climate crisis is its scale and complexity, which requires us to connect our everyday lived experiences with events unfolding in distant and disparate parts of the world. The photographic work made by the artists involved from Northern Britain and abroad emphasise this interconnectedness of climate-based issues, aiming to bridge the gap between our individual and collective awareness of global warming. This exhibition will show us ways that we might live in a changing planet. Today, we are very excited to have Charlotte Dobson and Simon Bray, two artists that were involved in this project. And I'm also joined here with Mario from the OpenEye, who's going to introduce the OpenEye part of this collaboration.
Thanks, James. Yes, I'm Mario Popham, and it's lovely to be here on behalf of OpenEye Gallery today. So just to share a little bit more about the project with viewers. OpenEye Hub is an exciting joint venture between OpenEye Gallery, Wigan Borough Council and Wigan and Lee College to establish spaces for photography and community in the Wigan and Lee area. We're aiming to launch the programme in winter 2022. Exact details around venues and dates will be announced very soon. The hub will be a space to share ideas, bring people together, and through photography, explore and communicate the urgent themes and issues of our times. And there is perhaps no issue as urgent as global climate change, and that's where we begin, through our collaboration with Then There Was Us and their extraordinary Ways of Living archive. I'm also delighted to be joined by our two newly appointed OpenEye Community Fellows, Sarah and Hannah. Hello, Sarah and Hannah, who are both alumni of the Excellent Photography Programme at Wigan and Lee College. They will be playing an integral role in growing and establishing the hub, and I'll be working with them to curate this inaugural exhibition with the Ways of Living artists. After the artists have shared some of their work with us, Sarah and Hannah will be kicking off the conversation with them through a Q&A. And so at this point, we'll hand things over to the artists. I think Simon will be going first for us and sharing his work in Lancashire. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, mate. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So the body of work that has been selected I have worked on is a series of images of Winmarleigh Moss, which is a moor sort of bogland near Preston in the north of England. And it's a collection of images made on a single morning, a visit with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust to document their work that they are doing along with scientists from Manchester Metropolitan University to sort of restore the peat bogland in that part of the world. Until this point, I really hadn't appreciated how important peat was to the sort of environmental efforts, of the world to store carbon. So I'm going to throw some facts at you through this a little bit, just to sort of paint a picture of how important it really is. So the Earth's peatland stores twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests combined. And so often I think, we hear a lot about how great trees are at storing carbon and how wonderful they are, but actually the ground beneath our feet can often, is storing more carbon than all the trees. And so peatland makes up 3% of our land surface, but stores as much as 30% of all the carbon. So it's an extremely valuable asset in terms of our fight against climate change, to make sure that that carbon is stored within the peat. The issue being that over, even pre-industrial revolution and throughout the last 100 years or so, farmers and industrialists have been draining these peat boglands and moorlands in order to use them for farming. So we've drained away all the water and it's degraded the peat. We've trashed it, burned it, and through that released an incredible amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And so there's been research about the amount of carbon has been released, and actually it's something like 250 billion tons of carbon has been released into the atmosphere through the sort of degrading of these peat boglands, which is sort of the equivalent of 7 years emissions burning fossil fuels. So it's an incredibly, it's storing an incredible amount of carbon, but if it gets treated badly, it's going to have an entirely adverse effect on our environment, to the extent that scientists have a term called the carbon bomb, which is a suggestion that, if we keep going down the path we're going in terms of degrading these peatlands, then it could have absolutely catastrophic effects. So the governments and the organizations involved are trying to switch the mentality from what it has been, where farmers have been paid by governments and given tax breaks and cash subsidies to convert peatlands to farmland, and now we're shifting away from that, particularly in this country. The British government has given, I think, over £1 billion to spend by 2025 on peat restoration, woodland creation, managing these habitats in order to store lots of carbon. Unfortunately, around the world, in places like Indonesia, they're still clearing incredible amounts of peatland in order to grow things like palm oil, and they just burn off the peat and release incredible amounts of carbon. But in this part of the world where I was photographing, in the northwest of England, the Lancashire Wildlife Trust and the scientists involved are making a really concerted effort to re-wet the peat and make sure that it's storing all that carbon and locking the carbon in. So the images you're seeing are lots of the sort of devices and gadgets that are doing those jobs by keeping that peatland wet. So the image you're seeing at the moment, that's a sort of similar thing, devices you'd have in your toilet in order to make sure that the water is at a certain level. So if the water reduces to below the sort of necessary level, then there's a sort of device which sends a signal to make sure more water comes through that pipe to make sure that that water flows through to keep the peat all nice and damp. Now, the way they're doing that is by they stripped off a load of the topsoil, a load of the soil that had been used for farmland, so that they could get to the sort of the peat, and then they've planted over 150,000 plugs of a new cover crop, and that cover crop is called sphagnum moss, and it's basically like a sponge. So that sphagnum moss soaks up all that moisture and it retains the moisture in the ground so that that peat stays really wet. So when you walk around here, there are certain walkways and pathways which are sort of mean it's safe to walk, because aside from that, it feels like you're just walking on a sort of bouncy, spongy sort of trampoline. So all this sphagnum moss is keeping everything really wet. And then the scientists have a few different ways of assessing the carbon levels in the water and in the peat to make sure that it's all being retained and they're not losing too much over time. And there's a few images of them sort of experimenting with their sort of particular devices, and these look sort of quite homemade. Some of them are extremely expensive pieces of equipment to measure the amount of carbon that's in the water. Some of them are sort of seemingly very homemade, just with like tubes and other bits and pieces. I don't know if we can see that particular images I'm talking about, but they sort of just rest these things on the water and then take a reading through their very expensive machine and record those and keep visiting over time, coming back to make sure that the carbon levels aren't that it's not losing lots of carbon. The other thing they can do is dig down into the ground. So they have a special sort of corkscrew type device, which they push down, and they can read and look through the soil and see what how the soil is degrading, whether through just looking at its composition and how dense it is. They can see which bits contain lots of peat and which bits are just sort of soil, and also measure the moisture and things as well. So in terms of taking these photographs, it was initially, it was a bit I wasn't very sure. I arrived, and it's a very sort of, you know, I had to turn up to this farm and then walk a mile or so to this basically empty field, and you know, it's a bog, so it didn't strike me as the most sort of photogenic place initially. But once I started learning and speaking to the scientists and speaking to the representatives from the Wildlife Trust, I learned so much about everything I've just shared with you in terms of the work they're doing and the processes. And so it suddenly came to life for me, and it was something I really wasn't aware of until that point. But watching the scientists go through these processes of experimenting and making these assessments really sort of enlightened me on what was involved and the importance of what they're doing. So I suppose this is just one site of many that I think they're working on in order to assess these carbon levels and make sure that the peat isn't being degraded. I think we still use peat in this country to a degree. It's being phased out in terms of being used for compost and stuff. I think until relatively recently, it was something that we used an awful lot in our gardens to feed our flowers and our vegetables and stuff. So, you know, that's an extremely you know, dangerous thing to be doing. You're releasing all the carbon. So and there are other questions again around things like whiskey, which uses peat in order to add flavor and things like that. So there's still a way to go in terms of educating people to make sure that they know the value of these peat boglands. They look very unassuming, but they're absolutely essential to make sure that our climate is regulated and is maintained at a level that is sustainable for all levels of life. So so that's the project. It was a real pleasure to shoot and to meet the people involved and to explore. As I say, it didn't feel particularly dramatic compared to other shoots that I've worked on, but actually learning about the importance of it means for me it's definitely one of the most important and engaging shoots that I've worked on in recent years. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks, Simon. Yeah, fascinating work. Now on a completely different response to some of the themes, yeah, we got Charlotte joining us as well. So Charlotte, would you like to tell us a bit about your project for the Ways of Living?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so for me, the project was about like existing through my presence and the camera's presence as well, because the camera can see things differently to the human eye. So this is how I went about it, and it was to just be with or be in the power of nature. So for me, the response to the climate and climate change is using creativity as a way for like an emotional output with climate anxiety. So yeah, so like I'll just explain as I go through. So this is like kind of a response to my surroundings. So the warm light on the skin, and this is just a moment where my dad was kind of just wondering, and sort of just like the warm orange tone just really feels really strong to me in relation to the climate. It's just like the images are like a reminder of my gratitude for light here, for example. Yeah, and then other things that I do is like walking is like part of the way to respond to the climate, sort of using this methodology, because you're in the surroundings, you're immersed in it. When you're walking, the surroundings always changing. So this was like at the sea, this part of nature, and the bubbles were just sort of just always popping, and it's just this constant movement in nature that I'm observing really. yeah, so this is another one from like the walking methodology, sort of looking at the alignment of the plants and sort of using the camera to say, wow, like look at how amazing and complex the nature is. I just wanted to use the camera because this would be hard to find in the exact same way again. Sort of this idea of worrying about the death of nature, almost just seeing it as it is and sharing that through the camera. It's really important. Sort of just like, so also not just walking around, but also bringing nature into a place, like inside. So this was looking at, I sort of really got interested in, with plants, it's like the textures of the plant and how it's almost like so close, but also far away, like it seems like untouchable. And it's sort of using photography as a metaphor almost, really. And like obviously with the soil, it's breaking down, it's quite dry but wet in some areas, and it's a study of the nature, really. Yeah, and sort of other processes that I use is the darkroom, sort of looking at the energy of nature. So it's like the scattering is really important, and I almost saw it as identical to the galaxy, almost like being like, where did this come from? How does nature work? Sort of really investigating how nature works, and looking through it almost like it's a human, really, like the comparisons to humans and nature. There's actually a book which is really interesting by Alan Watts. He says that like our world is our body. It's something that we need to look after. And so there's lots of comparisons to that throughout. Yeah, looking at again, like the warm light and just how nature everywhere we are is a constant reminder that without nature, like what would life be? It would continue without us. And sort of we've got to see it now, because otherwise we wouldn't see it again. Like what happens when we die? Like, do we see nature again? And we've got to look after it. And I feel like for me, photographing it is a way to really value it, and our relationship to it. It's like it's somebody else. We've got to spend time with it. Yeah, again, like I look at it far away, nature, closer up, and it's almost like I'm never satisfied with what I'm seeing. Like it's just like, and by doing this, it increases the importance of the problem that we've got with climate change. It's sort of finding a balance between not being too negative, looking at nature, because it can, obviously this issue can be really make us feel really negative emotionally. But at the same time, when we look at nature, we feel really really enlightened, for me anyway, emotionally. So it was finding this fine tune within the project. And then yeah, this is another still life image, sort of. It's sort of like, I was always interested with this orange and blue relationship throughout that you might be able to see. And it was thinking, even like everyday objects, I don't know, you might be wondering like, what is this? It's actually like an egg that was fried that my sister had, and I was like, oh, like that's interesting, it looks quite plastic-like. And I'm sort of looking at things around me and always finding these connections between like our human world and the natural world. And I just was interested in looking at the bubbles, as you've seen at the start of the images, and just looking at light behind it, and playing with light and colour is always a constant within the work, and just it's just like a fascination throughout. Yeah, and again, continuing to look at ideas of layers, like obviously I know we all know about the atmosphere, we all know about this, but sort of using our human materials in a similar way, almost creating like a mini world, I suppose. Just looking at the boundaries with light, what light passes through, what it doesn't, and like looking at the details when there's no colour. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, it's quite also something just to add is like it's quite performative. It's almost putting it can be quite forceful, like putting nature in front of the camera, but I'm almost like I'm trying to, maybe that's a way that I'm trying to highlight how this issue is like face forward in us. Like we've got a like there is oppression issue with it throughout all of our lives. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So yeah, two very different responses to the climate change. One's very looking at the kind of a very specific issue and way of managing. Another is a kind of quite a personal response to it, it seems. So yeah, I'll hand over to Sarah. Sarah, should we start with you, Sarah? If you got a question handy for Simon or Charlotte.
Simon, going first. So I think you really helped me understand what was going on by you kind of giving that talk alongside your work, because it was very sciencey when I first looked at your work, and your artist statement or words that you put with the work, I was a little bit lost on me because I'm not very sciencey. So that kind of answered the question for me, really. But I think, how would that be taken into like an exhibition space, the extra information for people who are not really that up on, you know, what the peat bogs and stuff, because I've had no idea about this happening. So yeah, okay, my question was basically, is there a way to help people understand it a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm like you, I'm not really a scientist. I'm absolutely not a scientist. I'm an artist. So I think as an artist, you can, you know, you find these veins of interest and these veins of things that are, you know, are intriguing. And this was a story that when it was offered to me, I just thought, I don't know about that. There's scope for me to learn here. And I'd like to think that for any audience that comes across this work, that they could do the same. You know, it's a chance for, you know, through the visual mediums to educate people and demonstrate what else is going on in the world. And this isn't necessarily to do with my perspective as such. It's more a means of storytelling, or you know, showing the document of this is what is happening in the north of England, and it's important, and this is why we need to give it a voice, and the photographs are a reason to share those stories. I suppose in an exhibition context, I imagine some sort of fairly carefully written text to introduce the themes would be really helpful. There are plenty of other sources of information. I'm sure the wildlife trusts and things would be very glad to have people directed towards their website in terms of demonstrating the work, the efforts that they're putting in, as well as the Manchester Met University. So, you know, I think, yeah, in an exhibition context, you know, some introductory text, maybe a caption or two to make sure that people know what they're looking at. You know, as I said, there's a few images of these strange devices and stuff that if you looked at, you might think that's just landed from space, but actually, you know, I'm sure we could introduce those things and demonstrate, you know, even just to say this is a carbon capture machine, you know, gives people an idea of what they're looking at, I suppose.
Yeah, I think back to like kind of that spoon-fed thing you were talking about, because it did make me go and have a look into it, which is probably what you want your work to do. But yeah, yeah, there was some machinery that I was like, well, what is that? Yeah. So,
well, I was the same in the moment. I was thinking this looks like it's an upside down mixing bowl, you know, it's been painted silver, and it sort of was, but it was doing an extremely important job in terms of the calculations they were trying to make.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, really useful for as we prepare the exhibition, isn't it? Just to have that. And we can talk to you as we go along, I guess, in terms of the captioning, and yeah, we can, what might be appropriate, what's too much, what's too little, get the kind of balance right, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I was thinking as well, just off the top of my head, including some of the moss in the exhibition. Is there a way that we can have a sample of it somehow in there? Because, you know, that seems to be key, the sphagnum moss itself.
Yeah, I imagine you could, you know, if you had a little sort of terrarium or a little tank or something, you know, try and keep it wet to make the point.
That's it, isn't it?
You don't
like
want
an aquarium or something.
To be sat there drying out. But I mean, maybe that was a sort of a way of adding a bit of a theatrical sort of performative element to it. If you've got that peat that is drying out in a sort of tank or something that people can observe and see, you know, what is actually going on. I mean, I suppose that's one of the issues with so many of these environmental problems, is that we can't see it. You know, I think if we could see the carbon rising out of the peat, we'd be horrified at it, but we can't. So that's why having these, you know, these images is hopefully helping to sort of educate people a little bit about these sorts of things.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, maybe one watered and one without, perhaps.
Yeah, just to see the difference. Yeah.
That could be quite interesting.
Let's make it happen. Yeah.
Invigilator kind of tipping it up with water.
Okay. Yeah, you can stand there just watering it.
That'll be me probably.
Yeah.
That could be my job.
Great stuff. Okay. How about you, Hannah? Have you got any questions for Simon?
Yeah, so I think I was just curious about how you like stumbled across the whole thing, because whenever I've heard of peat bogs, it's been that they've been like on fire on the moors or something, and like your look on it is a completely different perspective to anything I've ever heard about. And I looked and I was like, oh, they're supposed to be wet, and it wasn't even like something that I'd ever thought of, and it was like a shock almost. And I was just curious as to how you stumbled across it. Did you stumble across it? Was it something that you've like always known about a bit, something that's intrigued you, or just?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're right. I think most people, particularly around Manchester, you know, given the fires a few years ago, you know, on both sides of the city actually, and sort of a horrendous level of peat being burnt off and releasing carbon that had been captured in that ground since, you know, before the Industrial Revolution, you know, horrendous amounts of pollution being released. The story came to me through a commission from the Washington Post. So I was working as an editorial photographer, and they approached me, having seen a portfolio of my previous work, as, you know, sort of landscape environment based, and commissioned me to visit along with the journalist. And so it wasn't something I was seeking necessarily. It wasn't something I had in mind or knew anything about at all before. And the nature of these things is that you go and spend, you know, a few hours and have these conversations and shoot as you're having these conversations according to what is happening on the day. So I felt quite fortunate that it was a bright, clear day, and I could demonstrate clearly what was happening on the ground and in the ground, rather than having wet from above and from below, like there are sometimes in the north of England. But I suppose that's the nature of being an editorial photographer, is that you get to be introduced into these stories that you wouldn't know anything about, and it's a real privilege to be able to go and take the pictures, but then also, you know that those images will be demonstrated to people, in this case around the world. And this was taken in the lead up to COP26, the big climate convention, whenever that was, last year or the year before. And one of the images here actually made the front cover of the Washington Post as a means of demonstrating, you know, these stories and the really important environmental issues that these world leaders were discussing. And so, you know, if you'd asked me the day before I shot this whether I'd expect a photograph of a peat bog to ever make the front cover of the Washington Post, I'd say no. But you know, it's that important an issue, and the editorial team at the paper deemed it that important to demonstrate, you know, to their millions of readers, I suppose. So it's a privilege to do, and I really do hope it's educated people in terms of the efforts being made, but what they can do as well to contribute to making sure that peat gets looked after.
Yeah, well, it gave me a very big different perspective on it, because like I said, I've only ever heard of them being on fire, and it wasn't something that, you know, like you'd see them on fire, but it's never something that I thought like, oh, they need to make a conscious effort to make them wet again.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, for sure. Well, when you consider how much of the world's surface is peat, it needs a really strong, you know, and urgent environmental effort on behalf of all the countries around the world to make this happen. But it's good to know it's happening in the north of England.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, great for it to get that prominence on the front page of Washington Post. I mean, that's the best reach you can have, isn't it, really? So, yeah, and unlike forests, I guess, they're not, as you say, they're not visually kind of that impactful on first glance. So to get, for it to, I don't know, yeah, for that message to get out, you know.
Yeah, sure, and it's pretty ambiguous and underwhelming, you know, in reality. But when you dig into some of those facts, it's incredibly important. So yeah, it's good that those stories getting shared.
Yeah, and the moss is quite beautiful, just on a visual front, you know.
Yeah, and it was about me finding those, you know, reflections in the water and the different colors of the moss, and the scientists were very keen for me to see the more colorful the moss, the healthier it is, and that sort of thing. In a similar way that lichen on a tree, you know, if it's a particular color, it's telling you how healthy the air is. And the moss is, when it's thriving, it's sort of it's even more beautiful. So yeah, it was about finding those visual ways, I suppose, to demonstrate the sort of importance, but also the sort of beauty, and engaging the viewer with it, rather than just taking loads of pictures of just, you know, brown land with blue sky.
So as it, you know, I know your personal work is, you know, you don't regularly deal with the climate change as such. So has it changed your attitude in terms of the work you make? I know this was a commission and perhaps one you were led to, but yeah, has it going forward, has it kind of changed the way you work?
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed photographing in a landscape, in natural environments, whether that's, you know, nature itself, or making portraits in those sorts of environments. As you say, this story came to me, as it were, but I think I'm definitely far more interested in the way that I can utilize my photography to share messages about the environment. You know, it's a space in which I'm very happy to be making pictures, and I think there are lots of different issues. So I'm currently in conversation with one of the other wildlife trusts about documenting their rivers and how people use the rivers, in particular the fishing and angling clubs, which in an environmental sense you could think, you know, that's very you're using the river and you're taking fish out, or but actually lots of landowners, and in particular even private landowners, are doing lots to look after the rivers and make sure they're healthy, and restore the sort of, you know, the multitudes of the wildlife and stuff in and around the river. So I think there's always a story there that I'm interested in exploring in the near future. So I think this you know, the peat bog story definitely did push me towards thinking more environmentally, and how I can be more conscious, I suppose, with what I'm presenting.
Yeah, I mean, the rivers is another front page topic at the moment, isn't it? Especially in this country with you know, potential mismanagement going on at the moment in terms of the water companies. So yeah,
and the amount of pollution, you know, the acidity and alkaline levels within water, you know, and habitats being destroyed. Lots of environments that, you know, and I think one of those elements that you know, those elements are brought to the fore because people are suddenly enjoying swimming in these rivers, and actually going, oh, they're not really safe to swim in, you know, so are they safe for the wildlife, and safe for the fish and the things that, you know, survive there? And I mean, in the north of England, lots of the water comes from reservoirs, but actually in other parts of the country, the water that you have in your house comes from those water streams, from the rivers. So, you know, it makes it even more important to make sure they're looked after and clean and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm excited to get started with that.
Excellent. Yeah, important work.
Just something that I think is also quite interesting is your collaboration with the actual scientists involved with this. I think, like as Mario said earlier, we've got two projects here that are kind of completely on different ends of how to approach a photographic project. And I think something that would be quite interesting is how you saw that collaboration and how important that was with you, because obviously, as you kind of admitted, scientists, as I think neither of us, any of us in this call are really, but I think that that's such an important thing to kind of mention, is that collaborative aspect, kind of outside of well, I guess the arts in that sense. So how was that, and how did you kind of use that to kind of focus your project?
Yeah, I mean, there's within, even me being there for a few hours, there's multiple people that I'm collaborating with. That's the Wildlife Trust, the journalist, scientists, the farmer. So all these people are playing a part in a short space of time, educating me about the environment that I was in and the work that was being done. So obviously there's a sort of PR angle in that, in terms of, as an editorial photographer, they want everybody to know about the great work they're doing. But in terms of the scientists in particular, I think they were delighted to have somebody there documenting what they were doing. To a degree, I needed to leave them to make their experiments and things, but they were very engaged in discussing with me, the physical acts of what they were doing, particularly sort of trying to drill into the soil or using the carbon capture machine. And some of it, I suppose, if they'd started going into real depth, would have gone right over my head. But actually, they sort of tailored it really nicely so that I knew what to photograph in which moment. Lots of it involved me kind of leaping about over these water channels and making sure I was landing on solid ground and not like on a spongy peaty bog that I was going to sink into with an expensive camera. So even that, trying to find the point of view in a literal sense with a camera was intriguing for me, in order to demonstrate, rather than just here's a scientist with some piece of machinery that I don't know, but to give it context, to make sure you're seeing how they're engaging with both the land and the water and their instruments, and to try and demonstrate those things to the viewer, rather than we talked a little while ago about how would you demonstrate the finer details of this story. Well, some of that's really hard to portray visually, but to show that they're being sort of proactive with what they're doing and not just sort of standing and having a look. But there's also a photograph of the farmer which I made, which I don't think is in this selection, but he was an old chap, maybe in his 70s, and it was his job when he was a youngster in his early 20s as well, to drain this land, to make it viable for using as farmland. The government gave them subsidies in order to do that, and now within his lifetime, 50 or so years later, they're re-wetting it, and he's sort of part of the project in order to re-wet that. And I found that fascinating, because that's quite a quick turnaround in terms of the land usage and stuff. So I was intrigued, to see the conversations between the farmer and the Wildlife Trust and the scientists, and them all coming together to collaborate on something that was so sort of crucially important to the research and understanding how to look after the land and restore that peat. So it was far more than me just like swanning in with a camera and snapping around and hoping for the best. It was definitely all based around these conversations and me showing a genuine interest, because I was genuinely interested. But sometimes you go on an editorial commission and you think, okay, yeah, I've just got to get the shots, and I don't really know, this isn't really for me. But this really sort of enlightened me and got me excited. So I was really glad that the scientists were there on that day to show me and teach me, I suppose. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thank you.
Beg your pardon. Shall we get some questions to Charlotte now? Maybe Hannah could kick us off on that.
Yeah, so when I was looking through your project, I loved all the darkroom stuff. I personally love all the darkroom stuff. But I was wondering, so do you see them all connecting every single picture, or to you are they all individual statement pieces? Like you look at this picture and you'll read into it, or will you look at all of them and read into all of them as one?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's like a really like confusing process, but it all comes together at the end and throughout. Yeah. So like I think they all connect because of my like sort of, I'm just trying to find the word for it, like urgency to take these photos. There's always an urgency with each individual image.
Yeah.
To like, there's always, sorry, there's always an urgency to get that moment or to photograph that moment because I'm feeling some sort of way from being there.
Yeah.
So it's always like, it's always to do with being in different surroundings. You'll see that all of the images are taken in completely different places, completely different moments, but it's always about investigating the nature. But there's also like a really important moment for each image, and then they all come together as well because of the aesthetic. There's different colors, and so you'll see like oranges, blues, and with the film it's sort of looking at different colors. It's a really soft texture.
Yeah.
But then with the black and white images that are made in the darkroom, they have a completely different texture because of the paper in the darkroom. So it's sort of like the colors come with different textures with the mediums that I'm using as well.
Yeah.
So it's important for me, the colors, because I feel like with a series of full black and white, for me personally, just as a personal like thing, it's like I try to stay away from too much negative information with the news and like climate change. But it's like I understand that I need to see the negatives, but I also like have quite a hopeful desire, I suppose, for us all to see nature as much as we can.
Yeah.
And to value it. Yeah, and it's like sometimes the images come from different activities that I want to do, for example. So I feel like the exploration side of it guides individual images. So wanting to go to the beach to see the beach, the sand, the sea, and also like different activities. When I say activities, it can be like just being in a surrounding and like closing your eyes, like being quite mindful of what's around you, or just the senses of being with the plants. So it's kind of arranged. They're individual because of the moments and where I am, but they come together because of this need that I have to fulfill, really.
Yeah.
There's anything else? Yeah, it's just giving nature a stage before we can't see it anymore.
Yeah.
And then you had the question about the darkroom. Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Was that one of mine or was that Sarah's? Oh no, just
I think you've
with the darkroom stuff. And like as a personal thing, I love doing all the darkroom stuff. I've got a darkroom and stuff. But it was there something that you thought, oh, the darkroom stuff fits really well into this? Or was it just I want to incorporate darkroom stuff into it because I like doing it?
Well, at the time of like all the images that you see, I kind of go through different creative processes where I need to but like if the mediums can sometimes feel really right for me at the time. So for the darkroom images, they really fit in because it was wanting to because of the texture and wanting to see more, like see the outlines of the shapes, etc. So yeah.
Cool.
Sorry, Sarah, have you got anything to ask Charlotte about her work at all?
I think you've kind of really answered what I was going to ask you. I was intrigued about the photograms, but hearing you say about looking at what light shines through and what it doesn't shine through, that completely spoke to like the rest of the images of what you were doing there. And I think I was more interested to see, again, I think you've answered it, but the urgency of you taking those photos, I think my question would have been like, what do they make you feel like? Or did you go out looking for that image, or did you find yourself in a moment and think, I need to make this image? So kind of how they made you feel, or was it something kind of that you had to really think about and tailor it in?
Yeah, no, I'll like answer it in like 2 parts. I think that's all right. Like, I add more with the dark room stuff, like, because there's a total like fascination with it. I think it's like the process of X-rays is obviously something that humans, the society uses to assess an injury, or usually. So it was sort of assessing what I'd picked up, like the images, the photograms that you saw were pieces from the places that I'd been to. So it was seeing what it looked like in a different surrounding or environment. And with the photograms, it's playing with the light, which you're probably like interested in. I'm not sure, but you know, with the photograms, I don't know if you do them yourself, yeah. But it was that, like, the blocking thing. And then thinking about the electromagnetic scale, it's called the scale of light. It's really interesting to research and look into. And so that like guides the photograms, and just the noise of the tap in the dark room, the constant noise of the water is really calming. So just being around water actually has really calming effects. Yeah, and then the second part of your question with the emotions, sometimes I can feel very like not too many emotions, just completely not anxious about anything. Like nature can, like being in the nature can calm me down after taking the picture. But sometimes I can feel completely like overwhelmed. Other emotions are like sometimes just like not feeling like it's enough to sort of, when I say that, I mean not enough to capture how complex the nature is. Like I just don't think that throughout the images we can photograph how complex nature is, but we can photograph different smaller complexities. We can sort of gather a picture, but not a full picture. Just check it, what other emotions I feel. Just a feeling of determination to continue. It guides me into another image after taking one, or sometimes I might be like, oh, that's really interesting, I need to research that and figure out how my creativity can contribute even further to the crisis. Yeah, I think it's just a need to show people what I've been able to see through myself or the camera.
Okay, how do you see it being shown, your work? Do you see it like on a larger scale, or have you got any kind of ideas of how that would look?
Yeah, like I think it's how I'd approach it is thinking about how I'd want the viewer to feel.
Yeah.
Or like, yeah, prompt them to feel, not force them, obviously. So sort of sometimes thinking about the scale, it might be quite large, but some images might suit being a bit smaller and more intimate.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting to see. It depends what format. For example, if it was on a screen or something, it would be playing with the layout and 2 images together and the scale between those. But if printed, I'd think definitely about the texture of the paper, how it plays with the light, or how it can be quite rough sometimes, playing with these relationship between textures. Or it might be like playing with the light, so some might be projected, playing with projection, transparencies with material. Sometimes the images might be printed onto I don't know, wrapped around something, just playing with this idea of objects and how objects can change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sorry.
So yeah, I guess I was just going to ask about the kind of the anxiety that we all feel, I guess, around climate change, the kind of personal individual anxiety of, it's quite a traumatic thing to be confronted with, and it's quite hard to manage, I guess. Do you use your practice as a way to kind of manage that feeling of anxiety? And, is it kind of therapeutic for you, do you think?
Yeah, yeah, thank you for the question. I think it can be both, I think. So it's definitely a way to experience it, because I think through your own experience is the most, I don't know, for me, it's the most important thing to do with the anxiety, because I don't know, you can learn a lot from experience, basically. I'm sure like you've all like had experiences where you can read stuff about it, but having the experience is really like, can be really moving. And then in other ways, it sort of fuels anxiety more, because you just like, obviously all these, because you're seeing the nature, the thoughts about what's happening comes back to you again. So it's this, I suppose it's like a cycle, really. And but I think overall, using like creativity definitely does, because otherwise it feels like sort of like nature doesn't exist. I feel like for me, photography and visual work sort of is kind of proof that it looks like this, or it's sort of a proof, and that if it goes, or when it goes, it's sort of like a knowing that photograph is like a memory of it, I suppose. Like, but it's sad because we can't see it all, and it's sort of this idea of storage, like there's only so, it's not unlimited, really. So yeah.
That reminds me of something Robert Adams said once, about how photography is like an affirmation, really, just of like, the fact that things are the way they are, and to appreciate that, in a sense, however dark things get. But thanks for that, Charlotte. Fascinating in terms of, I guess we all think about our place in nature and forget that we are part of nature. I think that's what's led us to this point, I guess. So it's kind of interesting that you're questioning that for me. Okay. James, do you have anything you wanted to
I just think what would be quite good, I think, is to I think I'd kind of like to round up something to do with the project as well as a whole. I think that this conversation is a really great sort of insight into the complexity of this topic. I think that it's quite an interesting way to see how everybody can kind of engage in this in many different ways, whether that's some analytical process or through research and information, or through a much more kind of mindfulness approach where it's very like emotive and almost kind of linked to, and I think you're kind of right, Mario, to mention sort of the anxieties of it. I think both of these ways of working help with that kind of mental health aspect of it in many ways, whether that is through information and kind of understanding our environments, or through almost, I think sometimes I want to say, for any kind of new photographers who want to approach this type of topic, think about the different ways that these can be approached, and I think even for people who want to view the work and view this project, see it as a way to have personal engagement in it, whether again through information and kind of a direct kind of link to a topic, or through something more mindful, like the act of going out and actually just photographing the environment and almost being kind of part of it in some way. And I just think, again, just to kind of round up my thoughts on this, is that both, firstly, thank you again to kind of Simon and Charlotte for being involved in this. And I think it's really great to kind of see two projects side by side that have such a different way of navigating this conversation. I can't remember exactly who said it before, but it's such a hard thing to photograph. Like, how do you photograph climate change? I mean, aside from going down the route of something burning or something, completely just, the kind of the typical imagery that we have. I think that this has just been a really nice way to kind of see two very kind of contrasting pieces of work. And I think, again, the goals of this project are to kind of see how these things connect. And so, yeah, so I think from me there, yeah, it's a thank you again to kind of everybody. And thank you as well to both of the fellows for those great questions.
I've got one question for you, James. I'm just wondering about the archive itself and where you think it might be going, because you got amassed such an amazing collection of work, and obviously climate change isn't going anywhere for the time being. So I just wondered where it's where you think it might be headed, whether it would be growing or whether you have other kind of outputs in mind, I guess, and how to get the work out there.
Yeah, so this is something that's quite interesting. I think when you do projects like this, it's always hard to know when or if to end a project, because the stories inevitably change, or the perception of a story changes. And I think with something like climate change, it's a slow moving topic in many ways. We've been talking about this issue for years, and whether people do anything about it, again, it kind of goes back to that kind of complexity of the actual topic itself. I think the way that we very much see this project is it will be ongoing. It might not be something that we touch on every single week, because I think like I was saying, it's a much slower process in terms of how we look at a lot of the work. And I think through things like this exhibition, they're a great way to kind of almost take a pause, look at the work, to show some of the work that's in the project, and then return to it again to kind of see who else may want to be involved and who else can kind of contribute to this conversation. So I think the way that we very much see it is something that we can kind of keep that dialogue open and see where it goes. Ultimately, we can't really have an agenda with it, I think, because again, the conversations can be so wide and across so many different avenues. I think we need to have a really open mind with it. The way that a lot of the artists and photographers involved in this project have, in the way that they've approached that topic, in the way that they've photographed or created work, we're trying to kind of take a very similar approach. So some of that might be through showcasing different forms of content, through maybe going down the research route, maybe going into sort of information, maybe not, maybe getting more and more people involved, and maybe even at some point have some sort of like hosted workshops, events. I think again, yeah, it's a nice open project, and I think it's really wrong to say excited to see where it's going because of the topic. But in many ways, yeah, I think if we can do something that causes a bit of good and maybe makes people think differently about the topic, I think that's the goal, really. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Really, really valuable work. So yeah, looking forward to see where it goes beyond what we're doing here. So yeah, in terms of the exhibition, just watch this space. If you follow us on Instagram, OpenEye Gallery, and Then There Was Us, and various other channels, you'll find news coming up of the exact kind of whereabouts and dates and when it might take place. And also, there are, besides Charlotte and Simon's amazing work, there are 8 or so other artists involved in the exhibition too, both from the north of England and abroad. So it'd be fantastic to see it all together. Okay, thanks very much, guys, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Yeah, bye now.
Everyone.
Thank you.